In Daniel 6:1, it says, Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom. And remember, Darius had taken over this kingdom of Babylon. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar reigned for a long time, and then it was passed down to someone else and to someone else, and eventually it came into the hands of Belshazzar, and God sent a message to him on the wall saying basically, you have been weighed and found wanting, your days are numbered, and they're at the end. And in fact, he died that night when Darius the Mede came in and took over Babylon. And so here we see Darius. He doesn't do away with Daniel, but he uses him, and he decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, or governors. He's stationed throughout the realm in verse 2, and over them he set 3 administrators, including Daniel. So Daniel again is placed above all of these other people, and he is a foreigner, although he's been there for a lot of his life, many, many decades now. It's almost like he is, well, kind of like our 2 oldest kids. They were born in Louisiana, but they've been in Texas much longer than Louisiana. So they're almost native Texans, but not. But we do have 2 native Texans, okay? All right? The 2 little ones. Commercial's over. So you have 3 administrators, and Daniel is one of them. He's placed above all these other guys, and many of them are local guys. Many of them are ones who are trying to get above the next guy, trying to rise through the ranks, and Daniel again gets placed above them. And Daniel is an old man at this time, probably in his 90s. These satraps or governors would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. He had to place these 3 administrators over the governors because he had to keep tabs on them, because evidently it was something that would happen in government. Have you ever heard of that happening before? In verse 3 it says, Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. Kind of sounds similar to Joseph, right? But Daniel's he is now going to be placed in charge of the whole kingdom. And this is, of course, he would be second to Darius there, but very prestigious position, very responsible position. And it's because he had an extraordinary spirit within him. The king noticed that. Now, he didn't necessarily notice that it was the one true God that was living in him, but he did notice that there was something very much different in him. Well, look at what happens in verse 4. The administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. But they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Now, here's what we see in Daniel. We see that these men were getting jealous over Daniel. Daniel was a man who God had used in extraordinary ways, used in Nebuchadnezzar's life and used in previously right before Darius came on the scene. And Darius, we don't see anything that's happened with him, but he noticed something different about Daniel. And then whenever all these other administrators, these satraps, these governors and the other administrators, they were getting jealous of Daniel because Daniel was going to get elevated above all of them again. And so they're looking for a way to discredit him. They're looking for a way to bring him down. And by the way, isn't that what happens in politics all the time? People are always looking for the skeleton in the closet. They're always looking for something that they can bring against someone that is rising, someone they see as a threat, someone that they're jealous of. And that's what these administrators are doing. They are using their fleshly appetite for their own ambition to try to discredit Daniel. But everything they look at in Daniel's life, they can find nothing to bring up against him. Now, that's not the case for many of us. People could find stuff in our closet. People could find stuff about us and destroy us. But we need to be people that are like Daniel, that are people that are rising above the crowd, that are striving and going on with God. And Daniel was a consistent man. Look at what it says about him in verse 4. They could find no charge or corruption. Why? Because he was trustworthy. There was no negligence or corruption found in him. Here's the first point I want you to see. This is true of Daniel, but I'm going to make it an imperative thing for us too. Live a consistent life of faithfulness to God. Live a consistent life of faithfulness to God. That is what Daniel has been doing. He's been doing that. It's not something that happened just when Darius took over. You know, there are some people that will start acting a certain way because they're trying to impress someone. Daniel's not trying to do that. Daniel has been living a consistent life for decades in enemy territory. He's been living consistently for the Lord. And this is an imperative for us today to live a consistent life of faithfulness to God. Now, if you haven't been living a consistent, faithful life to God, you can start today. You can begin, the old saying, if I remember it right, the journey of 1,000 whatever begins with one step, okay? Anyway, a journey begins with one step. You got to start somewhere, so start today. That was probably a Chinese saying, and I don't know much Chinese, okay? Well, look at verse 5. Look what happens after that. After these guys are jealous, they're trying to trump up charges against him. They can't. But in verse 5 it says, Then these men said, We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God. So they decide, if we can't find anything wrong with him, we're going to look at his religion. We're going to look at his belief system, and we're going to try to find something against him regarding his beliefs. Sound like today's world? Well, in verse 6 it says, So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said to him, May King Darius live forever. By the way, it's just a standard way to greet a king, but it's also a way to try to flatter the king. All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors, I'm glad that we don't use those words anymore because we don't know what they are. And governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days, they're coming up with this rule, they're recommending it to the king. 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Now, we know why they set up this rule, but why did they set up this rule? It is because they did start looking at Daniel. They did start looking at what he did. They started looking at his belief system. And what did he do? Consistently, he prayed to God. And he wasn't ashamed about it. And you'll see later in the text, what did he do? He would open, we'll just get there, okay? In verse 8 it says, Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed. So, King Darius signed the document. Now notice verse 10, because this is the big verse. And in fact, Mackenzie, there's the second slide on there is Daniel 10:6 or 6:10, so you can put it up there. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upper room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So we see that what was Daniel doing? Every day he was going into his house and he was praying. He was praying toward Jerusalem. Why did he pray toward Jerusalem? Is it something that you have to do? No, but he was reminded of that's where the temple was. That's where his homeland was. And he was praying toward Jerusalem and probably even praying for his homeland in the process. But he would pray every day, 3 times a day. He made petition to God. And it was something that they knew was happening. And so that's the whole reason they made up this rule and offered it to the king and convinced the king. The king didn't know this about Daniel. The king liked Daniel. And if he had known this about Daniel, he wouldn't have made this rule. He wouldn't have signed it into law. But they convinced him to sign the law that says you can only pray to the king for 30 days. What do you see about Daniel? You notice verse 10? When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, when he learned that it was a law that you could only pray to the king for the next 30 days, what did he do? He went to his house, and he opened the window in the upper room toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he continued to pray to the Lord. He continued to pray. What is the big point I want you to get from that is this: be faithful and fearless in the face of persecutors. Be faithful and fearless in the face of persecutors. Daniel had been living a consistent life. And what did he do now when he's presented with this ungodly law? He lived for God just as he had been doing. He didn't change the way he was living. He continued to live as God had instructed him to live. He continued to be faithful to God. And that's what we ought to do too. Now, there are many people who they profess to be Christians, but they don't live a Christian life. And so when they face persecution, they go the way of the world. They do what comes easy. But listen, if you're living a consistent Christian life and God is your core, He is what your life is revolving around, then when persecution comes, it will be more natural for you to keep following Him in the face of persecution. I won't say that it'll be easy. It'll be a big decision you have to make. But Daniel had to make that decision. What did he do? He chose to go into his house, to go up to his upper room, to open his windows and pray. Now, what could Daniel have done? He could have kept the windows closed. He could have prayed quietly. He could have prayed and not let anybody hear what he was doing. Yet Daniel continued to be bold in his witness, and he continued to just be consistent in his life, not changing a thing. And I would say it's the same thing we need to do no matter what law gets passed in the land. No matter what the Supreme Court may say about homosexual marriage, we need to make sure that we are living consistent lives no matter what law may be passed. Saying, well, you can do this or you can't do that. Just keep living according to what God has already told you to do. Be consistent. And I want you to notice the rest of the text. Look at verse 16. Actually, let me finish reading where I was, okay? Because I didn't finish there yet. Look at verse 11. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. They knew they were going to find him there. He did it every day. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any man who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, as a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable. They didn't come up to him and say, Daniel just broke your law. No, they reminded him of the law he signed. It's a trap. And he knows it's a trap later. Verse 13, look at what it says. Then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. In verse 15, then these men went to the king and said to him, you as king know it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed. And so the king he's not liking what he did, and he realizes they have trapped him at this point because of Daniel. And look at verse 16. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. See, he knew now he realizes that Daniel is, maybe he thought Daniel would pray to him every day. Maybe he thought Daniel was one of these guys that he would worship other gods, but he is finding out that Daniel's a guy who's going to continue worshiping his God no matter what. But now he's pleading with Daniel, pray to your God. May your God deliver you. And he's hoping that Daniel's God would deliver him from the lion's den. But and he's probably heard the stories about Daniel too. So he has some hope there, but he probably doesn't have a whole lot of hope. He's probably thinking, this guy that I care about, that I respect, is probably going down. He is going to get eaten by these lions. By the way, I'll share with you the last point, and you can be thinking about it as we go through the text here. It's this: trust God completely and leave the consequences to Him. Trust God completely and leave the consequences to Him. You don't know how things are going to turn out, but you know if you should be doing something or not doing it. We should not worry about the consequences. I know we worry about the consequences, but let's not get hung up on the consequences. Let us be followers of God, be consistently following Him, trusting Him completely, and leaving the consequences to Him. They may be good, they may be bad, but we are not responsible for the consequences. By the way, what you perceive the consequences to be before you act for or against God, they may not be what you think they are, right? Daniel was thinking, before he got thrown into the lion's den, or at least Darius was thinking this, Daniel's going to get eaten by these lions. But see, that wasn't the real consequence, was it? Because God delivered him from it. Now, it could have happened. Daniel could have gotten eaten by the lions, and that's probably not the greatest way to go down. But if you got to get eaten by lions, at least get eaten by lions as you're serving the Lord, not from disobeying Him. Well, leave the consequences to God. Well, let's go ahead and look at the rest of the text here. He's saying, may your God whom you serve continually rescue you. Look at verse 17. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring. They poured hot wax around it, and he sealed it with a signet ring so that you could see if it had been broken. And with the signet rings of his nobles so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. Why? Because he cared for Daniel. And he hated that he was the one who got tricked into this. In verse 19, at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. I remember waiting for dawn one day. A couple friends of mine and I, when we were in high school, we decided to camp out, and I don't think we had tents or anything. We just camped out in the dark, and I just remember we had just gone way off into the woods and had our sleeping bags there and everything, and we didn't have much light. We didn't make a campfire or anything, but I just remember that it just got kind of creepy out there, okay? And we started getting creeped out about all the noises and everything, and I know you're saying, oh, you're just a scaredy cat, but we were getting creeped out. But whenever we started seeing the dawn come up, we were glad. We were glad dawn was coming up, and we were ready to get out of there, okay? I did camp out without being scared at other times, okay? Yeah. Well, but I haven't taken my kids camping, so maybe I'm still scared. Well, he couldn't sleep, but at the first sight of dawn in verse 19, the king got up and he hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. You know that he was not expecting to hear Daniel's voice, but he was hoping. He was hoping. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke with the king. May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. They haven't hurt me, for I was found innocent before him. Also, I've not committed a crime against you, my king. The king was so relieved to hear Daniel's voice from the bottom of that lion's den. So relieved to hear it. In verse 23, the king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. So Daniel was taken out of the den uninjured, for he trusted in his God. The king then gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den, they, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. That is a pretty bad thing. And by the way, sometimes other people suffer for your wrongdoing. Well, I want you to get something, because I've really made us think about Daniel. I've been focusing on Daniel, but the primary character throughout the Bible is God. And we need to remember that this story is about Daniel, but it's about God. Because Daniel would have been lunch meat, literally, if God had not intervened. God was the prime mover that was in Daniel's life here. God was the one who rescued him. Daniel was faithful, but God was the one who delivered. Daniel prayed, but it was God who shut the mouths of the lions. And it was also God who condemned these other men who had contrived all of this to the lion's den. I know that we see that the king did it, but I think he was following out what the Lord wanted him to do. What we need to do is we need to trust God, because He is a God of deliverance. Now, many times we're not really trusting God. Or we're like Peter, we're like some others, we are people of little faith. We need to believe God, truly believe Him like a little child. But how many of you are little children in here? Anybody? It was a bunch of little kids raising their hand, except for Lewis, but we really don't believe what he says, okay? So that's okay. But we all need to be believing like little children. But how many of you, since you've grown up, have had a hard time believing as a little child? That's why Jesus said, let the little children come to me. And we need to have faith like a little child. But we make things so complicated. We make them complicated, and they become getting complicated with our belief too. And we start reasoning things out. We start questioning things. We don't believe as easily as we used to believe. And that's something Jesus is telling us we ought to do, is believe like a little kid. Not questioning everything, but believing, simply believing in the Lord. And how often do we miss the blessings of God because we don't approach God with the faith of a little child? I know that I miss the blessings of God because of that. And I think Daniel probably had learned to trust God with big things and little things. He lived consistently in his life, but he trusted the Lord in the midst of all things. We know Daniel eventually passed away off of the scene, but God did some great wonders through his life. But when you look at these 6 chapters of Daniel we've gone through, and we've gone from him being probably a teenager in the very beginning to being in his 90s now, how much is not written in this book about Daniel's life? The rest of it, which is most of his life. But what do we find about the rest of his life? That he was consistent. That he was consistent in his walk with the Lord. And that's what we need to be too. We need to be faithfully consistent in our walk with the Lord. Well, let me close with this little reminder to us as husbands. Each year, if you're married, you encounter an anniversary of your marriage. And each year, hopefully, husbands, you remember ahead of time. How many of you have ever forgotten your anniversary? Many husbands will do something really great for their wives at anniversary time. They plan some big date, or at least a date, which is different from the rest of the year. And so they do something really big for their wives, and they want to share, they want to, do something good because it's their anniversary. They want to make it special. But how many of those husbands throughout the rest of the year, they do hardly anything for their wives? Nothing special. They're not recognizing them in any way. That's how it often happens with many husbands. But that's also how it is with our Christian life too. And the reason I share that is that Daniel was one of those guys who we see special times in his life where he was specially committed to the Lord. But that was because every day he was specially committed to the Lord. And God used him on these big moments, but he was every day consistent. It wasn't a one time a year thing, but it was something that he was consistent to do every day of his life. Living for the Lord, seeking the Lord, praying, talking to the Lord, seeking to put him first in his life. And listen, Daniel came long before Jesus. Well, long before Jesus came to the earth. We know that Jesus was around long before Daniel was around, because he's always been around. Jesus came later, after Daniel passed off the scene, and he came to the people of Israel. He came and shared with them about the love of God. He lived a perfect life. He was like Daniel in that respect, that nobody could find anything wrong with him. What they had to do was trump up charges against Jesus to have him crucified. But there is a difference between Daniel and Jesus. Daniel did have sin that people didn't see, and Jesus didn't.